Well, an old friend showed up today. I'm talking about the King of New York from 2006. Now, the King of New York is the fifth hubless wheel bike that I built. The first hubless I built was a Psychobilly Cadillac that I started building in 1998. It took me a while to get that bike done. It was just so involved, so much to it. The second bike was a bike I built 20 years ago in 2003, which was called the Money Shot, that I built for RJ Reynolds Camel Cigarettes for the Camel Roadhouse tour. Probably one of my favorite bikes that I've ever built. The third hubless bike I built was called the Chronic. The Chronic was a real dark green, almost black hubless bike, and it had aluminum and copper panels on the gas tanks. Harley Davidson big twin flathead engine in it, water cooled. Really, really interesting bike. I think maybe that one was a little bit overdone, but it's still a beautiful machine. The fourth hubless bike I built was called Mistreated. It was a red hubless bike that I built in the 2006 Biker Build-Off versus Russell Mitchell from Exile Cycles. And that one, everybody knows, infamously caught on fire at the end of that show. That bike was hands down the least favorite of all the hubless bikes I built, but it's probably one of the ones everybody knows best because of that monster fire. And the King of New York was the fifth hubless bike I built, and I started this bike in 2006. And finished it in late 2006, early 2007. And it's one of my favorites because it's so subtle. I love black bikes, as I think I've mentioned to you guys some of my other videos. Blue. My blue chopper was supposed to be black. I just like a black chopper, and this one's really subtle. I think it's got amazing lines. Let me go over the bike with you. Let me run through some of the basics of the King of New York for you. The King of New York's built on a rigid frame with 4 inches of stretch in the down tube, 4 inches of stretch in the backbone here, and 42 degrees of rake. King of New York's running a Palco Springer front fork, 10 inches over stock length. It's got a set of Signature Choppers Inc. ball milled handlebars. This is something I was doing in the early 2000s, all the way to the mid 2000s. Really love this look. I made the handlebars out of frame tubing, did the ball milling in it. Everybody knows that ball milling from the first Biker Build-Off, misbehaving when I did the frame and chrome plated the frame. So that's really where that comes from. The gas tank is derived from my Bobzilla bike. And I call this tank a Chopzilla tank. It's kind of an exaggerated, larger version of the Bobzilla tank for a longer frame. And this is the kind of tank I'm going to build for my Blow supercharged chopper if I ever get myself back to working on that bike. The engine in the King of New York is the S&S 96-inch Shovelhead engine. I won this at one of the Easy Rider motorcycle shows in Columbus, Ohio, I think in 2004, 2005, as part of the grand prize package for winning best of show. So I got myself a nice brand new S&S 96 Shovelhead engine that I took apart, polished, and put back in this bike. Baker 6-speed transmission. I was using these all the time. The best money can buy, hands down. Got to have that. Got my custom leather frame seat from Adam Croft. Adam and Paul Cox from New York City were doing my seats. This one's pretty amazing. You know, my seats and the way they fit the frame is a big part of what gives my choppers the look that they have. It kind of differentiate them from the Indian Larry bikes and the Jesse James bikes and a lot of the other bikes that are out there. So that's just a big part of the look of this bike. It seems so subtle, but the seats are really, really important. Oil tank's a handmade part that I was making around this time, the middle of the 2000s. I made maybe about a dozen of these. It's called a Bobzilla tank, and it's a copy of the tank that came out of my original Bobzilla knucklehead bike, but really a different shape than what anybody else has seen. And if you looked at my Psychobilly Cadillac, the Psychobilly Cadillac had the Peterbilt oil tank. And this is kind of a version of that shape, a little bit more ornate, and it's got the cooling fins on top. The battery would normally sit under the seat here inside the oil tank, but I love the way this oil tank looks. I love the shape of it, and I love kind of that open space that goes between the engine and the oil tank and the seat. And you can't do that with the battery there, so I put the battery underneath the gearbox. King of New York's got my Choppers Inc. aluminum neck wings. Those are derived from the Hudson Terraplane wings that I put on the Indian Larry biker build-off bike in 2003.
Time is of the essence. So what's in it for Larry? Real friendship and brotherhood is more important than like all the money and all the stuff.
Obviously, the centerpiece of the King of New York is the Hubless rear wheel. This is an 18 by 8.5 aluminum rim. What that means is 18 inches diameter to the bead of the tire, 8.5 inches wide or deep, however you want to look at it, and has a 280 millimeter Metzler tire on the rear. I'm not crazy about the 280. I'm not a big fan of the 280. I really like the 240 millimeter tire that Metzler makes. That's my favorite. This customer, when I built this for him, really wanted a 280. So I went ahead and did it because, you know, the customer's usually right. But that's the one thing that everybody really notices about this bike is this thing right here. Joe Richardson, who painted most of my choppers from the biker build-off days, painted the bike and did the purple pinstriping. That's that Gotham City pinstriping and paint look that you see there. But I had Craig Fraser do this amazing airbrush work and lettering on the tanks. Just the guy does absolutely amazing work. He's painted a few bikes for me and painted some of the best bikes I've ever built. Just love what he does. Naturally, you've got my patented 6-gun foot pegs. Here's the jack shaft and brake rig for the Hubless bike. Everybody sees the large sprocket on the rear wheel and thinks that it's a huge reduction and that the bike won't go fast or will wind out or will create a lot of torque but won't really go. Well, when you see most of the Hubless bikes that have copied what I've done, they're not using a chain drive like this. They're using a friction drive, basically using a wheel that will drive the tire up here through friction. And there's no way to handle the power and hold it. And so those things are kind of fugazi fakes that are just made to kind of go slow and be showboats. But this bike is really meant to ride, and you have to have the chain drive to do it. And the way I correct the large sprocket here is on this jack shaft. You see there's an inboard sprocket there that comes off the gearbox, and that's small. And then when I come to the outboard sprocket, I go to a bigger sprocket. So I go from a large sprocket on the gearbox to a small sprocket on the inside of the jack shaft, back to a large sprocket on the outside of the jack shaft, which corrects my ratio. So this bike actually has typical standard gearing that you'd have in a Harley Davidson Softail or a Shovelhead. But that's how I correct all that stuff. And then I put the brake on the jack shaft here, just not to encumber the rear wheel. So when you look at the rear wheel, it's a nice big open hole with nothing in the middle of it, nothing that you have to look at. The first Hubless bike had a brake on the wheel, and then I went and put it on a jack shaft. And I know a lot of people are going to say, oh, well, if you break the chain, you lose your brakes. And while that is a fact and it is true, I've been riding 35 years and have only broken one chain. And it was with Indian Larry when I actually broke that chain. And just a high horsepower bike. But you're not going to break a big O-ring chain like this. It's just not going to happen unless you're putting crazy horsepower to the rear wheel or you don't have everything set up right. Did some engine turning paint on this front billet aluminum wheel. You know, when you do the Hubless bike, that's the center of attention. So one of the things you want to do is keep everything else kind of subtle. So that's what I did with the King of New York. It's one of the reasons the King of New York is one of my favorite hubless bikes. The brake and clutch levers in the King of New York got that Indian Larry twist to them. You know, this bike was built after Larry died. So this is kind of a tribute to him. And you see the split at the top here, but these are actually connecting rods from a Harley Davidson V-twin engine. And this would be where the wrist pin would go. The wrist pin would go through the piston. And this is the oiling groove for the wrist pin right here. But I can show you, this is a Harley Davidson connecting rod. So I took the connecting rods, I cut them, heated them up and twisted them, gave it that little Indian Larry tribute. But that's what that brake lever and shift rod are made out of. It's something you have laying around the shop. I don't have to go do any special work. I literally just cut them, heated them up in the vise, twisted them, and then informed them to work with the machine, kind of repurpose some old parts that maybe had not a whole lot of life left in them. This thing's been sitting for a long time. It needs a new battery. The battery tray's underneath the transmission, so I got to get under here and get that thing down. I put the battery in the tray, then I use a motorcycle flat jack to kind of hold it up, to hold the weight while I connect the cables. Using the flat jack, I can just go ahead and raise the battery right up into the bottom of the bike. Makes it really easy. When a bike isn't ridden a lot or it's been sitting for a long time, there's a few things I do. The first thing I always do is check the battery, replace the battery. You know, batteries are usually good for about a year if you're using them. You know, you ride them 2 years maybe, and all of a sudden it dies on you one day. So, you know, you almost want to replace the battery every year. Always check the engine oil. And you got to realize with a Harley Davidson V-twin engine, a lot of times the engine is going to sump out, which means the oil from the oil tank through gravity is going to feed past the check ball in the oil pump and fill the bottom end with oil. So when you crank the engine up, they're really hard to start because the engine's trying to fight all the oil in the bottom end. And when it does, a lot of it goes out on the vent onto the ground, and some of it pumps back to the tank. So you want to make sure there's oil in the tank, but you don't want to fill the tank if it's been sitting for a long time, because when the tank is full and then the engine starts pumping the oil that's in the bottom end back to the tank, now your tank's over full and you need vent airspace inside the oil tank. So that's something to consider. Always want to put fresh fuel in it. If you've got bad fuel in it, you want to drain it. And a lot of times I'll put a fuel additive in the fuel just to combat maybe any spots of moisture, rust, whatever might be in that tank, in that fuel line, in the carburetor float bowl. And if I start having issues with the way it runs, I'll take the carburetor float bowl off and clean that out too. So I'm going to give it a shot and see what happens. Somebody's used regular old screw type hose clamps on this. That's not me. I don't do stuff that way. But I'm going to go ahead and replace these. But let's just turn the fuel on and see what happens. There's already quite a bit of garbage in the filter. I'm going to clean that out. I always check to see if the accelerator pump is squirting fuel. This one is. That's a good sign that the carburetor is not all gummed up. I always want to check points gap to see if arc jumps across. This one's not, so the points are probably dirty or there's no voltage to the circuit breaker. I'm going to find out what's going on here. So to clean the points, I just take a piece of fine sandpaper and fold it over so that it has two edges of sandpaper on it. And I just pull the points apart and just work the sandpaper back and forth in the gap. Now here's how I troubleshoot electrical problems. So I don't have any spark at the points, even after I clean the points out. Now here's my ignition coil. The ignition coil has two wires to it. One wire goes from the key switch to the coil to power it. Then the other wire goes from the coil to the circuit breaker. This is the wire from the coil to the circuit breaker. So this wire should only activate when I open the points, but the other wire should always be hot coming from the battery, and it's not. I checked that with a test light. So here's my test light, and you can see it's not on. The test light's grounded to the engine right now. I'll go to this key switch. Here's my power from the switch. You can see that the power is hot from the battery, and that goes to a circuit breaker. Both sides of the breaker are hot when I contact it. So that tells me that there's power through the breaker into the wiring to the coil. Now I'm contacting the test light to the hot lead to the coil that comes off that circuit breaker, and then you can see there's no power. What I'm going to do now to troubleshoot my problem is I'm going to jump power from the circuit breaker right directly to the coil. I'm going to bypass the wire that's in the circuit. Then I'm going to go check the circuit breaker and see if those points are arcing. If they do arc, that tells me there's something wrong in this wire. Maybe the wire is broken or it's grounded somewhere. If not, then the coil is probably bad. This blue wire now is my jumper. I'm just going to take my blue jumper to my circuit breaker under the seat here. Now when I turn the key on, that's going to give me 12 volts hot to the ignition coil. You can see the arc jumping when I open the points. So obviously there's something with my power wire that's going to that coil. It must be broken somewhere or contacting somewhere.